Nobody ever thinks they will be the person who crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed. Nobody wakes up in the morning planning to betray a promise they once held sacred. And yet, life has a way of unfolding quietly, almost invisibly, until one small moment becomes the turning point that changes everything. I remember the evening with a clarity that still unsettles me. The air in Malabo carried that soft coastal warmth, a mix of salt and humidity that lingered even after sunset. The city lights shimmered against the ocean, and there was a kind of restlessness in the streets, as if something important was always about to happen. I had gone out that night not because I was looking for anything, but because I needed to feel something different from the routine that had slowly settled into my life. My husband had been away for weeks. Work had taken him across borders, and although we spoke often, there was a growing distance that words alone could not bridge. It was not anger or resentment. It was something quieter, more dangerous. It was absence turning into habit. The bar was one of the more elegant places in Malabo, the kind where conversations are low but intense, and every detail is carefully curated to create an illusion of perfection. Soft music drifted through the room, glasses clinked gently, and laughter rose and fell like waves. I remember thinking how easy it would be to disappear into a place like that, to become someone else for a few hours. That is when I noticed him. He did not stand out in the loud, obvious way that some people do. It was something subtler. A stillness, a quiet confidence that seemed to draw attention without demanding it. Someone mentioned his name in passing, Baltasar in Gonga, and I remember recognizing it. He was known, respected, a man whose position carried weight and influence. But in that moment, he was just a man sitting a few seats away, listening more than he spoke. I do not know what made me speak to him first. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was the way he seemed detached from everything around him, as if he existed slightly outside the noise of the room. When our eyes met, there was no immediate spark, no dramatic shift. Just acknowledgement. A simple, human recognition. Our conversation began with something ordinary. A comment about the music, or the atmosphere, or the city itself. I cannot even remember the exact words. What I remember is how easy it felt. There was no effort, no need to impress. It was as if we had stepped into a space where time moved differently, where the usual rules did not quite apply. He spoke with a calm intensity, choosing his words carefully, but never in a way that felt guarded. There was depth in the way he listened, as though every answer mattered. And I found myself responding in kind, opening up in ways I had not expected. We talked about work, about life, about the strange ways people drift apart without meaning to. At some point, I became aware of the shift within me. It was not sudden. It was gradual, like a tide coming in so slowly that you do not notice until the water is already around your feet. I should have recognized it for what it was. I should have stepped back, created distance, reminded myself of who I was and what I had promised, but I did not. Instead, I stayed. Hours passed without either of us noticing. The bar grew quieter, the crowd thinner. Conversations around us faded, but ours continued, weaving through topics both trivial and profound. There was a kind of honesty in that space, the kind that only exists between strangers who do not expect to see each other again, and yet, something deeper was forming. When he laughed, it was rare but genuine. When he paused, it was thoughtful, never empty. There was a gravity to him, but also a warmth that made it easy to forget everything outside that moment. I told myself it was harmless. Just a conversation. Just an evening, but even then, I think a part of me knew it was more than that. When we finally stepped outside, the night had settled fully over the city. The air felt cooler, quieter, as if the world itself had slowed down. For a moment, we stood there without speaking, both aware that something had changed. This was the moment when I could have walked away. This was the moment when everything could have remained untouched. Instead, we kept talking. We walked along the street, the sound of distant waves accompanying us. There was no clear destination, no plan. Just movement, just presence. And with each step, the distance between what was right and what was happening grew smaller. I remember the exact moment when the boundary disappeared. It was not dramatic. There was no declaration, no sudden decision. It was a look, a pause, a shared understanding that did not need words, and then, it happened not in the way people imagine, not with passion overtaking reason in an instant. It was quieter than that. More complicated. A mixture of vulnerability, loneliness, and something that felt dangerously close to connection afterward. The silence was different, not uncomfortable, but heavy. Real. I remember sitting there, suddenly aware of everything I had done. The reality of it did not crash over me all at once. It settled slowly, piece by piece, until there was no way to ignore it. He did not say much. Neither did I. There was no attempt to justify it, no effort to turn it into something it was not. We both understood the weight of it, even if we did not fully acknowledge it. When I left, the city looked the same, but nothing felt the same. I walked back alone, every step echoing with thoughts I could not silence. I thought about my husband, about the life we had built, about the promises that now felt fragile in a way they never had before. I told myself it had been an accident, that it had just happened. But deep down, I knew the truth was more complicated. It had not been a single moment of weakness. It had been a series of small choices, each one leading to the next, until there was no turning back. In the days that followed, I tried to return to normal, to slip back into my life as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. Not just in my actions, but in my understanding of myself. I had always believed that betrayal was something clear and obvious, that it required intention, desire, a conscious decision to hurt someone else. Now I understood that it could also come from confusion, from loneliness, from moments where clarity fades and emotion takes its place. I never saw him again after that night, and perhaps that is part of what made it so difficult to process. There was no closure, no continuation. Just a single moment suspended in time, carrying consequences that would last far longer than the moment itself. Even now, I think back to that night in Malabo, to the quiet conversations, the soft music, the way everything felt so distant and so immediate at the same time. Nobody expects to become the person who crosses that line, but sometimes, life does not ask for permission, it simply happens. Nobody ever tells you how the moment truly begins. People think it is sudden, like a spark in the dark, something explosive and undeniable. But in truth, it is quieter than that. It grows in the spaces between words, in the pauses that stretch just a little too long, in the way two people start to notice each other beyond what is appropriate. Before anything happened, before that line was crossed, there was a moment that stayed with me longer than anything else. It was the moment when everything shifted from harmless to something I could no longer pretend not to understand. We were still in that same bar in Malabo, though by then the night had deepened. The music had softened, conversations had thinned, and the lights seemed warmer, almost dim enough to blur the edges of reality. Time had already slipped away from us, and neither of us had acknowledged it. It felt as though the world outside had stopped existing, leaving only that small space we occupied together. He had moved closer at some point, though I could not say exactly when. It had happened gradually, naturally, as if distance itself had become unnecessary. Our voices had lowered, not because we were hiding anything, but because the moment demanded it. There was an intimacy in the quiet, a kind of closeness that words alone could not explain. I remember looking at him and realizing that I was no longer just talking to a stranger. There was something else there, something I should have questioned more deeply. But instead of stepping back, I leaned into it, drawn by a feeling I could not quite name. We had been talking about life, about the strange ways paths cross and diverge. He spoke about responsibility, about the weight of decisions, about how sometimes people find themselves wondering what might have been if things had happened differently. There was a seriousness in his tone, but also a vulnerability that made it impossible to ignore him. At some point, our conversation slowed. Not because we had nothing to say, but because something unspoken had taken its place. The air between us felt heavier, charged with a kind of awareness that neither of us acknowledged directly. That is when it happened. He reached out, slowly, as if giving me time to pull away. His hand moved toward my face, and for a brief second, I felt my breath catch. I should have stepped back then. I should have remembered everything that mattered, everything that defined me, but I did not move. His fingers brushed lightly against my cheek, a touch so gentle it almost felt unreal. It was not forceful, not demanding. It was careful, deliberate, as if he was testing the boundary just as much as I was allowing it. My heart was racing, though I tried to remain still, to understand what was happening before I reacted. But understanding was already slipping away, replaced by something deeper, something more instinctive. His hand lingered there for a moment before moving slightly, his fingers tracing the edge of my face in a way that felt both unfamiliar and dangerously comforting. I could feel the warmth of his touch, the closeness of him, the quiet intensity that had been building all night now condensed into a single moment. And then his gaze shifted to my lips. It was not a fleeting glance. It was intentional, steady, filled with something that made it impossible to look away. I felt exposed in a way I had not expected, as if he could see through every layer I had built around myself. My thoughts were scattered, trying to catch up with what was happening, trying to remind me of who I was and what I should do. But they felt distant, faint compared to the immediacy of the moment. His fingers moved again, this time brushing lightly against my lips. It was such a small gesture, so simple, and yet it carried a weight that I cannot fully describe. It was not just touch. It was meaning. It was intention. I felt a shiver run through me, not from the contact itself, but from what it represented. That was the moment when everything changed. That was the moment when I stopped pretending this was just a conversation, just an evening, just something that would pass without consequence. He did not rush. He did not push. He simply stayed there, his hand resting lightly, his presence steady and undeniable. And then he spoke. His voice was softer than before, almost as if he was speaking more to the moment than to me. He said something that I did not expect, something that seemed to come from a place deeper than the conversation we had been having. He said he wished he had met me earlier. At first, I did not fully understand what he meant. The words hung in the air between us, simple but heavy. And then he continued, his gaze never leaving mine. He said, quietly, that he wished he had been the one to marry me. The world seemed to pause. I remember feeling something shift inside me, something I had not prepared for. It was not just surprise. It was something deeper, something that reached into a part of me I had kept guarded for so long. Those words should have been dismissed. They should have been recognized for what they were, a moment of emotion, a passing thought, something that did not belong in reality. But they were not. They landed in a place I did not know was vulnerable. I felt my chest tighten, my thoughts unraveling in a way I could not control. There was something about the way he said it, not as a joke, not as a casual remark, but as something genuine, something he had allowed himself to feel in that moment. And I believed him. That was the most dangerous part. One believed that in that moment, he meant it. I tried to respond, to say something that would bring me back to reality, but the words would not come. Instead, I just looked at him, searching for something that would make sense of what I was feeling, but nothing made sense anymore. The room around us faded further, the sounds, the lights, everything becoming distant. All that remained was the space between us, the weight of his words, and the way they had settled into my heart. I felt something open inside me, something I had not realized had been closed for so long. It was not just attraction. It was not just curiosity. It was something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to longing, and that is when I knew I was in trouble, because it was no longer about the moment. It was no longer about the night, it had become something else entirely. His hand slowly dropped from my face, but the feeling of it remained, lingering in a way that made it impossible to ignore. His words echoed in my mind, repeating themselves over and over, as if trying to root themselves deeper with each passing second. I should have stepped away then. I should have reminded myself of my life, my marriage, everything that mattered beyond that moment, but instead, I stayed. I let myself feel what I was feeling, even though I knew I should not. And that was the moment when I started falling. Not suddenly, not all at once, but in a way that felt inevitable. It was as if something had been set in motion, something I could no longer stop even if I wanted to. I found myself looking at him differently, seeing not just the man in front of me, but a possibility he had introduced with his words. A possibility that should not have existed, and yet now felt impossible to ignore. We continued talking after that, but it was not the same. Every word carried a new weight, every glance held a deeper meaning. There was an awareness between us now, something unspoken but undeniable, and I could feel myself slipping further. I tried to tell myself it was just the atmosphere, just the emotions of the night, just something that would fade once I left. But deep down, I knew it was more than that, because his words had not just touched my ears, they had reached my heart, and once something reaches that place, it does not leave easily. By the time we stood up to leave the bar, I was no longer the same person who had walked in. Something had shifted, something I could not undo. The night air felt different when we stepped outside, cooler, sharper, as if it was trying to bring me back to reality. But reality felt distant now, overshadowed by everything that had just happened. We walked together again, but this time there was a silence between us that was not empty. It was full of everything we had not said, everything we were both aware of but unwilling to confront directly. I could feel his presence beside me, steady, calm, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed, and I knew it. I knew that I had crossed a line, even if nothing had fully happened yet, because sometimes, the moment you truly cross the line is not when actions follow, it is when your heart does, and mine already had. After the moment has passed. People talk about temptation as if it ends when you walk away, as if distance alone can undo what has already taken root inside you. But the truth is, sometimes the real struggle begins afterward, in the quiet days when memory becomes louder than reality. The 2 weeks that followed that night in Malabo were not ordinary days. They stretched and folded in strange ways, each one carrying a piece of that evening with it. I tried to return to my normal life, to routines that had once felt stable and predictable, but everything now seemed slightly out of place, as though I had shifted into a version of my life that no longer fit me the same way. I thought about him more than I wanted to admit at first. It was just small moments. A memory of the way he spoke, the calm steadiness in his voice, the weight of his words when he said he wished he had met me earlier. Those words refused to fade. They stayed with me in the quiet, repeating themselves in my mind in ways that made them feel more real with each passing day. I told myself it was temporary. That it was just the intensity of the moment lingering longer than it should. That with time, it would lose its hold on me, but it did not. Instead, the feeling grew. It became something I carried with me constantly, something that shaped my thoughts in ways I could not control. I found myself comparing everything to that night, to the way I had felt in his presence, to the connection that had seemed so effortless and so dangerous at the same time. And slowly, without fully realizing it, I began to want to see him again. That realization did not come all at once. It formed gradually, like everything else had. A thought here, a question there. What if we talked again? What if it had not just been a single moment? What if there was more to understand, more to feel? I tried to resist it. I reminded myself of what had already happened, of the line I had crossed, of the consequences that could follow if I allowed myself to go further. But those thoughts felt weaker compared to the pull I was experiencing, because it was no longer just curiosity, it was something closer to longing. After nearly 2 weeks, I reached a point where the silence felt unbearable. Not the silence around me, but the silence between us. The absence of him had become more noticeable than his presence had ever been, and that is when I decided to try to see him again. Even now, I struggle to explain that decision. It was not rational. It was not careful. It was driven by something deeper, something that had taken hold of me in a way I had not anticipated. I made inquiries quietly at first, asking in indirect ways, trying to find out where he might be, how I could reach him without drawing attention. I knew he was not an ordinary man. His position, his influence, everything about him came with layers of protection and distance that made access difficult. Still, I tried. Eventually, I found a way to approach the place where he was known to spend time, a more private setting, far removed from the openness of that bar where we had first met. I remember feeling a mixture of anticipation and unease as I got closer, as if every step was taking me deeper into something I did not fully understand. But I never reached him. His bodyguards stopped me before I could even come close. They were polite, but firm. There was no room for negotiation, no opportunity to explain myself. To them, I was just another person trying to get access, another unknown presence that needed to be kept at a distance. I tried to insist, to say that I knew him, that we had met, that it was important. But my words carried no weight in that moment. They did not recognize me, and even if they had, it would not have mattered. There are barriers in life that are not meant to be crossed, and in that moment, I was standing in front of one. I remember the feeling of standing there, just a few steps away from where he might have been, yet completely unable to reach him. It was frustrating, confusing, and strangely grounding at the same time, because for the first time since that night, reality pushed back. I was forced to see the situation for what it was. He was not just a man I had shared a moment with. He was someone surrounded by a world I did not belong to, a world that operated on rules and structures far beyond my control. And I was on the outside of it. I left that place feeling a mixture of disappointment and something else I could not quite name. At the time, I thought I had lost something, an opportunity, a continuation of what had begun that night, but I did not yet understand what I had actually been given. Time passed, and slowly, the intensity of my desire to see him again began to fade. Not completely, but enough for me to regain some clarity. I started to reflect more deeply on everything that had happened, on the choices I had made, on the direction I had almost allowed my life to take. And then, months later, everything changed again. News began to surface. At first, it was scattered, unclear, something you could easily dismiss as rumor. But as more information came out, it became impossible to ignore. There were allegations, serious ones. Stories began to circulate about him, about his private life, about relationships that had been hidden from public view. The details were shocking, not just because of their scale, but because of the people involved. He was being accused of involvement with a large number of women, many of whom were connected to powerful figures, to leadership circles, to positions where discretion was expected and exposure could have significant consequences. The number being mentioned was staggering, more than 200. I remember reading those reports and feeling something inside me shift again, but this time in a very different way. It was not longing. It was not curiosity, it was realization. Everything I had experienced that night, everything I had believed to be unique, to be meaningful, to be something rare and unexpected, suddenly felt different, smaller. Not because the moment itself had changed, but because my understanding of it had. I began to see it in a new light, to question the things I had accepted without doubt. His words, his actions, the way he had made me feel as though I was being seen in a way that mattered. Had it been real, or had it been something he knew how to create? That question stayed with me, not as a source of anger, but as a source of clarity. Because the answer, in the end, mattered less than what I had almost done with it. I thought back to those 2 weeks, to the way I had felt, to the decision I had made to try to see him again. And for the first time, I felt something close to relief, because I had not reached him, because his bodyguards had stopped me, because a barrier I had been frustrated by had, in reality, protected me from something far bigger than I had understood at the time. If I had seen him again, if I had continued down that path, I might have become part of something I could not control, something that could have followed me far beyond that moment in a world where exposure spreads quickly, where private actions can become public stories, where names and faces can be drawn into narratives without warning. The consequences could have been significant. I might have found myself caught in something that would not just affect me, but everyone connected to me, my husband, my family, my life as I knew it. And suddenly, the disappointment I had felt that day was replaced by something else entirely: gratitude. Not for what had happened, but for what had not. It is a strange thing to look back on a moment you once wished had gone differently and realize that it went exactly the way it needed to, that being stopped, being turned away, being denied what you thought you wanted, was actually the thing that saved you. Even now, when I think about that night in Malabo, about the words he said, about the way I felt in that moment, I do not deny that it was real to me, but I also understand that reality is layered. What we feel in a moment is not always the full truth of what is happening, and sometimes, the things that do not happen are just as important as the ones that do, because they shape the path we continue on. Nobody expects to be protected by disappointment. But sometimes, that is exactly what it is.